Several minutes passed and everyone remained silent, creating tension. Dolores asked Vicar and Tudor again if they thought the Night Hound was not a good person. Sancho, who had his arms crossed, and Tudor, who had his hand behind his head, were somewhat surprised and could not help but start to sweat. They did not know why she was asking this question. Vicar simply kept calm and stayed silent. Piggy, who was next to him, became somewhat nervous and thought that this was not good. With an angry look, Dolores asked him why he was so sure that the Night Hound was a bad person. She called Vicar's attention, asking him to respond quickly. A drop of sweat began to fall from his cheek. He remained silent without saying a single word. Tudor, who was next to him, started to observe him and with a regretful look realized that he had made a mistake. Several seconds passed, and silence continued to reign. Dolores stood up, placed both hands on the table, and she assumed that he could not respond to that. He had asserted it based solely on testimonies, without any proof. As a journalist, if one said something that was not clear, one should not forget that this was a position in which one could ruin the innocent life of someone. Tudor interrupted, and with a serene look argued that the guards had also testified. The Night Hound had been the one who destroyed the building and killed the director of the orphanage. Upon hearing this, the attention of the Saintess fixed on Tudor. With a serious look she explained that what the Imperial Guard had said was just a speculative statement, without physical evidence yet. Somewhere in the orphanage, which was connected by metal stairs, there was a bunch of hands full of blood. She argued that this incident had taken place in the basement of the orphanage. The mystery of the discovery of ancient corpses of boys and girls still remained unanswered. There were many strange things about that the Night Hound, the assailant, would harm children. Upon hearing this, both Anna, Banka, and Sinclair began to observe her and could not help but be somewhat surprised. Dolores' gaze was filled with firmness and confidence. Although the incident had occurred in an orphanage run by her family, no one knew why she remained neutral. She turned her head towards Anna and with a serious look explained that she needed to review the article little by little so that it was as objective and impartial as possible. Anna, who was somewhat nervous, reached out to one side and assumed that if that was the case, then there was nothing more they could write. Dolores replied that it wasn't too late to publish a critical article when the reason why the Night Hound did what he did became clear. With a lost look, she started looking at the ground and began to think about the Night Hound. Several seconds later, her face filled with a smile. If the Night Hound was truly evil, then they were going to criticize him very harshly. Vicar, who was sitting next to her, started to look down and fell silent. Then he raised his head and his gaze fixed on Dolores. At that precise moment, another club member opened the door and interrupted the conversation, calling Dolores' attention. Dolores, who had both arms resting on the table, felt somewhat confused and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. The student approached her and with a calm look explained that Professor Banshee, the club advisor, was calling her. He wanted them to edit the article again to say that the Night Hound would clearly be the bad guy. Dolores put her hand on her face, closed her eyes, and remembered that Guy liked to create problems. She decided to meet with him and talk. Not long after, she left the room and closed the door. Tudor, who was watching the door with a surprised look, mentioned that the club president was very determined. Vicar started looking at the ground and replied that she used to be like that too. Upon hearing this, Tudor looked somewhat confused. Vicar began to remember the Dolores from his past life. She had the same appearance as the Saintess who had led the Holy Knights at the front of the battlefield. While with one hand she was invoking a spell, she extended the other forward and with a determined look, she ordered the Holy Knights to keep pushing the front line harder, since nowadays, religious women were only corrupt. While two knights who were taking a break were talking among themselves, she appeared, clenched her fist and asked them if they could not save at least one more person during their break. She started to scream and revealed that in her time, if a demon appeared, she would immediately run to crush it. Remembering this, Vicar, who had his eyes closed, couldn't help but smile and feel an inner peace. He hoped that his actions would be seen as those of a villain, but it wasn't a bad feeling when someone wanted to know the truth. Dolores met with the professor and they both began to discuss among themselves. Vicar thanked her from the bottom of his heart. The next day, it dawned and the academy's speaker began to sound so that all the students would wake up. Upon hearing the sound, Piggy, who was sleeping like a log, started to open his eyes. Although he was very sleepy, he still decided to get up and sat on the bed. Vicar, who had gotten up before him and was doing some exercise, said good morning to him. Piggy started to remove the sleep from his eyes and returned good morning to him. In the academy, everyone had to wake up at 6 a.m. When the alarms went off, the students headed to the training area in front of the dormitories. The students arrived at the training area and began to run to warm up. They participated in the exercises, following the instructor who was at the front to wake up. and then started their day with a light run. Once the exercises were finished, everyone took separate paths. Some were going to catch up on their sleep and some were going to take a shower while others were going to go to the cafeteria. After doing this, Piggy was quite tired. While he was walking next to Victor, he closed his eyes and sighed. He believed that his brain would be more active if he slept during morning exercises. Victor, who was next to him, explained that moving the body helped keep one's brain active. Piggy replied that he didn't need to be told what was right. Behind them were Sancho and Tutor. He started looking at Victor, and with a cheerful smile asked how someone like him would be popular with girls without being empathetic, advising him to improve his empathy towards Piggy immediately. Piggy refused. Tutor put his hand inside his pocket, turned his head towards Victor and asked if anyone was free this weekend. He wanted to go have fun in the city. Piggy started to show a smile since for him this sounded good. There was actually a book that he wanted to buy in the city. Sancho, who had his arms behind his head, mentioned that there was a restaurant that he wanted to try. Victor simply started to walk in silence. Upon seeing this, Tutor asked if he was free this weekend. Victor came out of his trance, and with a calm look replied that he needed to do volunteering during the weekends. Sancho, who had his arms behind his head, was somewhat surprised to hear this. Piggy started to touch his neck, closed his eyes and thought that Victor had many deductions. Tutor crossed his arms and began to smile and asked if it was Professor Vinci Morg again. He was messing with Victor even though Victor wasn't doing anything. Victor started to walk, turned his back on them and fell silent. He began to move away from them and told them that they could go to the city without him, leaving them all somewhat confused. They also started to walk and Tutor thought that volunteering sounded fun. Piggy didn't want their friend to do this alone and they also decided to go with him. According to Sancho, the more there were the better. Tutor put his hand under his chin and with a confused look thought that this was very unusual. Sancho was somewhat surprised and asked him what it was. Victor began to move away from them, and Piggy started to follow him. When Victor was close, Tutor naturally felt drawn to him. It was as if he were his older brother. According to Sancho, he was someone quiet but exuded charisma. When Sancho was a mercenary, people like Victor were natural leaders. Piggy, who was walking behind Victor, could not help but start to smile and feel an inner peace since for him Victor was amazing. Tutor and Sancho began to follow Victor and Piggy, and at that moment a student who was accompanied by two women passed by their side. Incredible people like Tutor, from the physically large family of Don Quixote, and Sancho, the transfer student from the Northern Guild of Mercenaries, were approaching Victor first. For Piggy, he was also kind since he had helped him at the welcome party when he had difficulties, and he was someone perfect in his studies and training. Piggy approached Victor and couldn't help but start to smile since when he was near him, he could feel that he could do anything. At that moment, Victor turned his head back and his eyes filled with rage. Upon feeling his gaze, Piggy panicked and couldn't help but start to feel fear. The student, who was accompanied by the two women, began to emit a sinister aura of green color, which started to expand everywhere. Upon feeling this aura, Victor turned around. With a smile, he began to walk away from them, and Victor started to stare at him intently. With a calm look, he remembered that Piggy knew the students well, so he asked if he knew anything about this guy. Upon hearing this, Piggy was somewhat surprised. He mentioned that the guy who was in between the two female students was the most handsome student in this school, named sophomore Bane Kudzak. Victor started to stare at him with a murderous look and couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly. This guy was exuding the same aura as the 10 elite corpses. No one would have thought they would be so active within society. Bane prepared to turn the corner. Victor and the others turned around and their gaze fixed on him. Victor didn't know whether to attack now, but for now he decided not to do it since there were going to be many casualties. He couldn't let the future heroes get hurt. Sancho, Piggy, and Tutor were somewhat surprised and called his attention. Victor started looking at Bane and decided to follow him under the pretext of going to rest since he wasn't feeling well. He began walking towards him with the intention of gathering some information first. He activated the second slot skill called Silent Heal Mashusu of rank A+. Victor began to take off his glasses and with a determined look decided to follow him. And at that moment, Dolores started to go down the stairs and she was somewhat surprised to see how handsome RMC was. Her eyes filled with surprise and she began to scream. Upon hearing this, Victor turned his head to one side and upon seeing Dolores he couldn't help but become alert and think that this was not good. Upon hearing the scream, the attention of Piggy, Tutor, and Sancho shifted towards them, and they were shocked to see what their eyes were seeing. Dollars fell from the stairs to the ground. Victor took off his glasses and approached her to help her. Tudor and the others began to run towards her, asking her if she was okay. Tudor touched Victor's shoulder with his hand and with a serious look gave him the order to hurry up and apologize. Victor decided to obey, lowered his head and with a sincere look apologized to her. Sancho helped Dollars get up, and she forgave Victor since she was also careless. According to her, he was so muscular that she had thought she had collided with a wall. Victor put on his glasses again and looked away. Dollars began to observe him and her eyes filled with confusion since she had not felt his presence. She did not know who the hell he was. Victor started to look down. There were many people, so it was better for him to delay his plans to follow him. The student Bane went down the stairs. Victor turned his head to one side and remained silent, watching the stairs. As night fell, Bane, who had his arms around the girls' necks, took them to a dark place. They thought he was much more cunning than he seemed. Bane suddenly stopped walking and decided to tell them some bad news. Upon hearing this, the two girls were somewhat confused. He revealed that recently a boy had appeared and had been bothering him. Because of him, he hadn't been able to eat properly. Upon hearing that he was harassing Bane, the girl with purple hair decided not to forgive him. He explained that he was going to see who that guy was, but because he had mistakenly worn his school uniform, he had run instead. He could have seen that one of Bane's students from the academy was there. The blue-haired girl asked him not to worry since if that guy came to the academy, they would stop him, as they would always be on Bane's side. Bane began to look down and thank them from the bottom of his heart. According to him, their hearts were beautiful like their faces. At that moment, he put his hands on their faces, leaving them in shock. Bane began to imagine the Night Hound wearing a pandemic mask. He knew that Victor had the ability of a high-ranking graduate, so he knew that he had not died in an explosion like that. Gradually, the faces of the two girls began to deform. Seeing that the Night Hound was attacking places connected to locations where he had eaten, he knew that he was a human who had felt the presence of a demon. The demon Bane, who had his hands on the girls' faces, slowly began to devour them, and his eye turned green. The face of one of the girls appeared on Bane's face. She was very scared and started to ask for help. His eye began to shine as he realized that the Night Hound had something to do with Andromalius's death. He belonged to the demon's 10 elite corpses, and he was the 9th corpse named Dantalion. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.